I think it's important that I introduce the reproductive spectrum. Okay, so as I said over there, sex is really good because it increases genetic variability. Though, in terms of genetic variability, the worst thing to do is cloning, right? Because it's exactly the same. After cloning, a little bit better, not great, is parthenogenesis. This is what like female lizards will do. Some female fish can do this. Basically, they lay eggs that are viable. It's their own DNA, but they have actually gone through gene shuffling. They've gone through meiosis. So there is some variation in there, but not a lot. Inbreeding comes next, right? So it's still reproduction, so you need some reproduction. If there's no reproduction, the population would die out at the end of the species. Inbreeding is when you're breeding with, close relatives. The problem there is that we all have these, try to read my handwriting, parthenogenesis, yeah, cloning. The problem is that we all have these recessive alleles, these really nasty recessive alleles for things like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia, we'll get to that in a minute, that aren't expressed because there's a dominant allele that's covering up, that's masking their effects. If you have two of these recessive alleles, if you're homozygous recessive, then you have this trait, and that's really bad. There's a greater likelihood of offspring getting those, becoming homozygous recessive, when you mate with individuals who are more closely related to you, because they probably have a very similar genetic makeup as you, right? This is why you've seen, like, there were stories of, who were they? The Romanovs in Russia. They had the kids with the hemophilia. A lot of the, the Habsburgs and the Bourbons. They're so freaking inbred, right? Because they could only mate within their social class, within a caste system, and it just created like. And then, by the way, it wasn't just in Europe; it happened throughout the world. Whenever you have like, these social caste systems, you tend to get much more inbreeding. Best thing to do is sex with strangers. Strangers you know really well. Okay? But basically, we'll call outbreeding. Breeding with individuals that. Now the funny thing is humans don't like to do this so much. Right? We tend to be very selective. There's a funny thing where we tend to pick people that look like the people we grew up around. Yeah, we do. But we don't mate with the people we grew up around. Even in like they've done this in kibbutzes, they've done studies in kibbutzes, and you guys know what kibbutz is? In Israel, it's basically an intentional community. You have like, many different families. You have 100, 200 people. Kids all grow up together. Rarely do people end up marrying somebody from their own kibbutz. It's very rare. Even though they're not genetically related to each other, they could, but they choose not to. We tend not to select the people that we grew up around. We don't like to do that because of this whole inbreeding thing. But when we choose somebody, they tend to be a lot like the people we grew up around. Okay? All right.
He looks nothing like my dad, but he acts like my dad.
So there's this.
Not at first.
There's this interesting thing that can happen where you get what's called a so polymorphism just means multiple forms of the same gene. Basically multiple phenotypes. Kind of like in the pepper moths, right? Not all pepper moths were white, not all of them were dark, they were both light and dark. And you will find cases where one allele will not totally take over the other allele. They become balanced over time. And having both in the population becomes beneficial. This, one of the reasons for this can be what's called heterozygote advantage. And this is where there's an advantage to having both the dominant and the recessive allele. Okay. Having 2 of the dominant alleles isn't as good. Having 2 of the recessive alleles isn't as good. Having 1 dominant, 1 recessive is good, is best. But what that does is it means that their offspring, you're going to get these, which may not be as good, but you still keep getting them because this heterozygote form is very advantageous. Let me give you an example. The classic example here is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a genetic trait caused by a recessive allele. And folks who have sickle cell anemia, it's really awful. Anybody know the rapper Prodigy? Mobb Deep. He was in a band Mobb Deep back in the 90s. Anyway, he had sickle cell anemia. He ended up dying at the age of 41, which is a typical lifespan for people with sickle cell anemia. What happens is the red blood cells, I think you guys probably know, the red blood cells don't form properly. They have this sort of sickle shape to them. So they tend to get clogged in the veins and blood vessels. It's very painful. It's really awful. There are treatments for it, but you can't cure it. It's treatable, but not curable because it's a genetic disorder. If you look at the incidence of the sickle cell allele, it corresponds very closely with the distribution of malaria. Malaria is the deadliest pathogen of all time. It's estimated that 1/2 of all humans who have ever lived died from malaria. That's how deadly malaria is. It's probably the strongest single selective force humans have ever encountered. Okay? Malaria, it's a parasite, it's a plasmid, gets into your blood, and it reproduces within your red blood cells. However, if you have this sickle cell allele, you don't have to worry about it. So, being homozygous dominant gives you no protection against malaria. You could die of malaria. Having 2 sickle cell alleles means you're going to get sickle cell anemia, and you probably won't live that long. Interestingly enough, though, you will live long enough to have kids. Being heterozygous is best. So it gives you some protection, but it doesn't kill you from sickle cell anemia. Yeah. Anybody know where the word malaria comes from? It means bad air, because they didn't know that it was carried by mosquitoes. They just knew at certain times of year people would get it. And they thought it had something to do with the air. So it was actually mosquitoes that were coming in. Malaria. Some other kind of cool stuff. So sometimes the success of certain phenotypes can vary, can depend upon how frequent they are in a population. And being more uncommon can sometimes be beneficial. And this is a look at these are water bugs, and their survival rates. The ones that were pale brown, relatively uncommon, they tend to die less than the ones that are more common. So sometimes having that odd trait is conferring an advantage. This may be, again, a step towards the evolution, towards a change in the color of that thing. You could be like witnessing that happening in action, right? Because there's selection for an uncommon phenotype. So over time, we'd expect that one to grow and to become more common. Okay, adaptation. I mentioned adaptation before. Adaptation just means that it allows you to increase your fitness. More babies than your neighbors. Organisms become adapted to their environment through adaptations of different traits, different genes over time are selected for to give them that mosaic that helps them best survive in that environment. Natural selection really is the only truly adaptive force. You could argue that sexual selection is adaptive in that it increases your ability to find mates, But sometimes that runs counter to your own survival, right? As is the case with the widow bird and the big tail sticking out. So, and what Sahabi was talking about, that there is this pressure to show off your genes, how good your genes are, and that can get you killed, which I sometimes refer to as testosterone poisoning. Okay? Young men doing really stupid things. Okay? So, really the only truly adaptive microevolutionary force is natural selection. Everything else, usually is not adaptive. All right? Okay. Any questions before we move on to speciation?